Good morning, Bitcoiners. This is Daniel from the Bitcoin Citadel, and today is day 52 of the Citadel Summer. The title of today's show is Martial Law Hot, and what I'm going to talk about is what's going on in Canada right now. I live in the United States. I am very close to the Canadian border. I go to Canada all the time. I love Canada. I think there's a little animal right beside me. It was pretty crazy. I think that Canada is one of the best countries in the world for Bitcoiners. There's more Bitcoiners per capita in Canada, and I'm just making this up, right? It fights above its weight. Just think of all the great Canadian Bitcoiners and all the great Canadian Bitcoin companies, right? CoinKite, Bitcoin Well, Bull Bitcoin, Blockstream, all of those companies are Canadian. You could just rattle off probably a dozen of the most important thinkers in Bitcoin. Jeff Booth, Canadian, right? Why is that? Why is that? And how does that tie into today's topic? Well, let's explore that for a minute. So Canada is right next to the United States. So all of the propaganda from the United States media, which is, if you follow Nolan Bowerly, another great Canadian Bitcoiner, the way that fiat propagates, one of the ways it propagates is through the media. That's one of the nodes of propagation of fiat, right? And Canada gets slammed because they get all the propaganda from the United States, but they also get all the propaganda from the Canadian media, and the Canadian media is basically all state media. You know what I mean? In the United States, we at least have some free media. I mean, there's a lot of propaganda that comes directly from the CIA in the United States in the media. That's come out recently, and people who are paying attention realized that long ago, right? So a lot of Canadian people, all of the news that they get is this state-sponsored media propaganda, as well as the super loud, blaring propaganda from the other side of the border in the United States. So they're probably the most propagandized people in the world, right? And Canadians are, there's a really high level of education in Canada, but it's the kind of education that is that credentialist kind of education, you know what I mean? Where smart people learn how to parrot the propaganda, and you learn, the side of the bread that's buttered, and you're like, oh yeah, I understand that, and that's how you get ahead, right? In Canada, I think, in the United States too, but Canada is an amped up microcosm of the United States. So you got a lot of smart people in Canada who are just programmed, right, by the state media and the stories that the state media is telling. And the stories the state media in Canada has been telling recently are progressive stories, right? That's the way of things in Canada now, just like it was until very recently in the United States, and we still have that hangover here, right? So we have the what's the big stories that they're telling us, right? Well, there's all the diversity, equity, and inclusion stories, which are huge in Canada, right? That's how the incredible amount of immigrants that have come into Canada recently was just accepted, right? Look at the numbers. Just do it for yourself. I'm not judging anything. Just look at the numbers of immigrants that have come into Canada. And the state-sponsored media, the propaganda, has said, this is a great thing. Don't worry about it. We're cool with it. And now Canadians are dealing with some of the results of that, which is, in some ways, the amount of housing is there hasn't been a ton of housing that's been built in the last 10 years, but there has been a huge increase in population, and therefore housing prices have gone up. You don't have to be a brain surgeon. You don't have to be a genius to figure that out, right? But that's not a story that you hear in the media. Another story that's really big in Canada is climate change. The narrative of human created climate change and the negative impacts of it is a big deal. And a lot of the policies of the Canadian government are driven by that narrative. And that narrative is pounded into people's minds through the propaganda of the state-sponsored media on a day-to-day basis. And if you watch Nolan Bowerly's show in the morning, The Great Awakening, and he used to do it on The Breakup, his old YouTube show too, The Great Awakening on Rumble, every morning he talks about he just reads from the news, the stories about one of the parts of he calls it NPC news, You know what an NPC is, right? A non-player character. So this is the news for the NPCs, right? And every single day, there's this weaponized climate hysteria that's, propagated to people through the fiat propagation node of the media. Well, what's the upshot of that? It makes people pay attention to things like forest fires that are related to climate change. There's a causal link between climate change and forest fires that's been established. And what is the upshot of that? Well, for some people whose brains get damaged by this propaganda, right? What that does is it makes that connection, and it makes them, these people become activists, and they say, hey, one of the things that is caused or proves that climate change is a problem is forest fires in the summertime. And I want everybody to know, right, that climate change is a big problem. So one of the ways that this could be, this message could be clearly sent to everybody is by having more forest fires. So somebody like maybe a firefighter in Western Canada decides that he's going to go out in the woods and set fires, right? Because then the message will be very clear that climate change, is causes fires. Even though I set them, I'm not doing anything wrong. I'm just pointing out to people that, climate change is a big problem. If I set a fire, right, maybe that's my little part that I'm doing to help wake people up to this big, big problem, right? So this firefighter goes out and he sets 30 fires, and the news doesn't look into brain-damaged arsonists setting fires. They say exactly what he knew they would say. Look at this increase in these dangerous forest fires, right? Our narrative of climate change causing this, these forest fires, and then bad air quality and the lower quality of life for everybody has been validated. And then maybe somebody else, gets an idea that setting forest fires is a good way to, amplify this signal, this message. So more people are doing it, right? And I'm not saying that it doesn't get dry in the summer. It does. I'm not saying that forest fires can occur in the summer. They do. My problem is that the media barely acknowledges what I believe is a significant contributor to the problem, probably more significant than climate change. And here's how you could figure that out if you wanted to. We've had dry years before, right? Let's look at the number of fires we're having now with a population that's been propagandized to the extent that they have to trigger some individuals who are susceptible to the propaganda and to taking action in the way that this guy did who set the 30 fires. And let's look at years where there wasn't that kind of propaganda, that were dry years, right? And see how many fires there were then. right? And compare them. And that should give you an idea of what's contributing more to wildfires in Canada, right? Is it global climate change, right? Global warming, or is it the psychological damage inflicted upon susceptible people by the global warming narrative, right? Does that seem like something that could be investigated? And if we had an independent media, that maybe that would be investigated, right? Does that seem like something that first principles thinkers would consider, ponder? Yeah. But instead, we are where we are. And in Canada, it's the narrative has come to the point where, and I think in some ways, I don't know how conscious they are about it, right? But the powers that be, the authorities in Canada now realize that they've pushed people over the edge, and maybe there's too many of these people that have been activated to connect global warming and fires and say, I'm going to play my part. I'm going to set a couple of fires. And that's why we're at this point where I call it, martial law hot. And I'm not exaggerating that much, because the power of government is the control of violence. And the way that they control that is they say, if you go in the woods, I'm going to fine you $25,000. Okay, how is that violent? Well, it's because if you don't pay the $25,000, guess what's going to happen to you? Your ass is going to get thrown in jail, right? So they're going to use the power of the state to control your movements. And guess what? The people who keep you in jail have guns. And if you try to leave jail, they'll shoot you, right? Inside of jail, there's a very strong narrative of violence and rape and things of that nature. So this $25,000 fine really is the state's use of the stick, right? It's not a carrot, it's a stick against their own people. And my feeling about it, and I'm just guessing, but as a person who is a keen observer of this situation and a first principles thinker who likes to think outside the box, what if they did, what if this is the response to this fiat propagation node, the story of global climate change tied to fires in the summer, right? Broken brains, fires started, arson is really the problem, not the dry weather. That's why we have so many of these fires. And they're like, whoa, we pushed a few too many buttons. Now we can't let anyone out in the woods because we have too many crazy people. It's not because of people's shoes causing static electricity. That's obvious. You see people in ATVs in the videos that are patrolling the parks. You see them out there with weed whackers, I wouldn't be surprised if some of these rangers were out there smoking butts, right? It's not that. It's that they can't have people out there anymore because there's too many crazy people who are going to set fires. That's what these folks in New Brunswick and Nova Scotia are worried about, right? They overplayed their hand. That's it. That's the only explanation. So how does this tie back to Bitcoin? The way it ties back to Bitcoin is people stop paying attention to these fiat propagation nodes, to this news. You get your news from, you can get your news from Twitter, for example. It was so funny. I was at a party recently, a couple of years ago, and it was before the current U.S., the election that brought Trump in, right? And people with Trump derangement syndrome were so mad that he wasn't sitting in jail, that he was actually running a campaign for president, and there was a likelihood that he was going to win, right? They were so mad about it. And I don't care about Trump, right? I'm a Bitcoiner. I don't care about politics that much. I like the fact that what they've done has made it better for Bitcoin in some ways. It's worse in some ways. It's better in others. The regulatory framework is better for Bitcoin in the United States. I think Bitcoin's going to win regardless, right? At least we have 15 years to find out. What I think is these people who are susceptible to this propaganda, these are not dumb people. They're people who trust the news somehow, Somehow they still trust the news, and they trust the government to a certain extent. They believe the government is going to help them, right? They're so angry. They're so spun up, right? And these people who are friends of mine at this party were so spun up that because I wasn't all this vitriol about Trump was coming out, and I was just like, the same could be said of the Democratic Party and Biden. As a matter of fact, I'm more about this progressivism and socialism that's coming out, and this DEI and all these other things that are coming out and infringing upon our freedoms as Americans than I am about Trump, to tell you the truth. Oh boy, that was not good, right? That was not good. And all of a sudden, a group of people were all surrounding me, just letting me know in louder and louder terms, louder and louder voices, what the fiat propagation story was. And I eventually, I wasn't going to change my mind. I eventually said, yeah, that's cool. We can agree to disagree about that. And that didn't really mollify them, right? So we got to think that as Bitcoiners, these propaganda nodes have less effect on us, right? Bitcoin allows us to peel back the onion. People aren't into Bitcoin if they trust the government or the financial system anyway, right? So you have that leg up. But it also allows us to, and one of the stories to get back to that was, where do you get your news? That was what people asked me. Where do you get your news? Because I had a different take on things, right? Where do you get your news? And they're like, do you get it? Do you get it from Twitter? Are you getting your news from Twitter? From social media? And I was like, yeah, I don't watch stupid news. I haven't watched the TV news in forever, I don't read the stupid newspaper. You know what I mean? And that was because I was considered I was an ignoramus at that point. I was like, oh yeah, okay. We know where you're coming from now, buddy. I'm proud of it though. I'll wave that flag forever. I get my news from I get my way to read the news from people like Nolan Bowerly. And I read it and I can laugh at it, right? I actually read books, right? And I stock my mind with this information from the books that I read. And that helps me to form a worldview where I can, make predictions about what I think is going to happen in the future. And if those predictions come true, that validates that worldview to a certain extent. And if they don't come true, I can say, hey, maybe this worldview is not correct, right? That's where I am. I'm not one of these people anymore that watches the news and just takes it for granted. Not even Bitcoin news, right? I watch a lot of Bitcoin content on YouTube, right? I see a lot of Bitcoin content on Twitter. But that doesn't mean I believe it, because there's shills in Bitcoin too, right? You have to be able to, and I think people are actually getting good at this. Your bullshit detector has to be pretty sensitive, right? You have to be able to follow the money, That's cui bono, the old Roman, phrase. Follow the money. Who benefits? And you can use that to process the news, right? So martial law hot. That's where we are in Canada. You can't hike in the woods. $25,000 fine. And this is how I make sense of it. Let me know in the comments how you make sense of it, right? Because it really is crazy, to tell you the truth. You can't go in the woods in Canada in August. You guys don't have much. Canada doesn't have a very long, nice season. Now in August, is about as nice as it gets. I'm in the woods right now. And imagine if I couldn't make my videos here because some crackpot prime minister whose policies and whose propaganda had pushed people over the edge so that they've started so many forest fires that it's out of control, told me I couldn't come out here and make my videos. It's crazy. It's crazy. But we can laugh about it, right? Because we're Bitcoiners and we know that things are going to get better. We know we're at the dawn of a golden age. All we have to do is get our hands on Bitcoin and find a way to hold it, right? That's all we got to do. Look in my bio, the description. book a call with me if you want. I can talk about stuff like this with you for a half hour call for free, right? Like, subscribe, comment, all the things that you do on YouTube. I want you to do them, right? Citadel summer's coming to an end soon. I have a great one tomorrow. I actually had a whole different video that I had planned out in my mind. But then this morning when I woke up, I thought of martial law hot, and I said I have to do a video about that. So that's today's video. Little humorous, I hope. I hope I didn't rub people the wrong way too much. I love Canada. A lot of my Bitcoin friends are Canadians. Canadians are the best Bitcoiners in the world, and it's because they've learned how to, they don't trust their government and their media. They're the least trusting of the government and their media of anyone in the world, in the financial system. And the heat is coming down on them, right? So that they're already, ahead of us in the U.S. and in some other places in the world, because they have to be. The shit's coming down in Canada real fast. And we in the United States should pay attention and observe what's going on there. And I am. Anyway, I will talk to you tomorrow. Peace.